I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Billy Dawton. Dawton? Oh, go ahead, please. Please clap. With talking all sorts about computers and the real world with his presentation title, Less is More, How to Help Computers Efficiently Understand the Real World. Take it away.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Billy. I'm from the Humanophilic Systems Laboratory at Kyushu University. I've got the unenviable task of following that incredibly interesting presentation about Japanese whiskey. So I'll do my best. So first, what do we mean when we talk about computers in the real world? Well, computers, as you know, can do lots of things. You know, they can do calculations, send emails, even play games. But in this case, I'm talking about the capacity to process, leverage, or modify real-world information. So, for example, if you have images, you can use Photoshop and edit them. If it's video, you can use Final Cut, which is another computer program. Or audio, you can use Logic Pro. These are all ways that you can modify real-world information with your computer. The problem, though, is now we just have too much data. And this can be seen if we look at the sort of files that are being used, right? So now with image, we have TIFF, which is 6 times bigger than JPEG, 4K video, which is a whopping 18 times bigger than standard HD, there is such a thing, and high-res audio, which is 10 times bigger than MP3. So the file sizes are getting huge. And there's an environmental and financial cost involved with all of this data. If we're storing them on data centers, well, a single data center consumes the same amount of electricity as 50,000 homes. So, you know, especially these days with the price of electricity, I can let you imagine quite how expensive that is. But the upshot is that it limits access to certain technologies. If you can't afford to access the data, if you can't, you know, access a data center, then you can't use these technologies. And this is particularly a problem in the field of AI or machine learning. So what I mean by that is machine learning is when we use data to make decisions or predictions about the real world. And so that's what I mean when I say understand the real world, right? Use data and then use it to decide things. In current AI-related research, there's a humongous focus on performance. Which is great because that's what gives us our technologies that work, anything cutting edge, but it requires a colossal amount of data. To give you an idea, the prediction is that in 2025, the data associated with all of this will be in the order of 100 zettabytes. That's a lot of data. So what needs to be done? Well, my approach is I wanted to optimally acquire this real-world information. And what I mean by that is that I want to reduce the amount of data that we acquire when we, you know, take it from the real world, and thus the data that we store and the data that we use. And I want to use the information that we obtain in this way, in particular in machine learning applications. Hence the name, Help Computers Efficiently Understand the Real World. So this is what real-world information looks like, believe it or not. This is our efficient approach, and this is our computer understanding the world efficiently. When we talk about information, very often what we're talking about are signals, right? And when we talk about real-world signals, they have certain properties, but the most important one is that they're continuous, which means that for any time on this interval here, there will be a value. And for any value between the minimum and the maximum value, you know, it can take any possible value between those two. It's completely continuous. There's no discrete steps. For the rest, then, of this presentation, I'm going to use an analogy. I want to think of signals as boxes. Both contain information, and the characteristic of your box and of your signal, well, they're both defined by the contents, right? So if you've got a box full of toys, that's a toy box. And if you've got, you know, a signal coming out your electric guitar, well, that's an electric guitar signal. Often, though, we're not actually interested in the box. We're much more interested in the contents of the box. And so if we think about this a bit more technical, and I'll try not to get too technical, we can represent our previous signal in the frequency domain. So instead of looking at it as a function of time, we're looking at it as a function of frequency. And we can think of this as the signal's contents. But in fact, it's just a different way to represent the information that's contained inside the signal. It highlights different signal properties. How does this information then get into the computer? Well, it's a process called analog to digital conversion. How do we get the box into the computer? If we start with the analog input signal that we had a look at previously, we can assign at discrete time intervals, so here we say every second, a discrete amplitude value. So it's quite easy to see that, for example, here, that's very easy to assign this. But at this point, we need to decide, where do we assign it? So we assign it to number 7. And what we're doing here is that we're discretizing the analog signal. And this is what we're left with. This is what the computer sees. A set of individual sort of timestamps with information, and each level has been replaced by ones and zeros, which is something a computer is very comfortable with. The number of samples required to make sure that our signal can be properly represented in the computer is determined by something called the Nyquist rate. And very simply what it says is the number of samples is directly related to the highest frequency in the signal. Therefore, it's directly related to the size of the box. The bigger the box, the more samples you need to represent it accurately. If we do so, then we get a faithful representation in the computer. However, it's very important to note that not all of the information is necessary, right? If we have a box full of toys, we don't actually want every toy. We only want a small selection of them. So the first question that we had to solve was, is it possible to obtain only the relevant information that we want using fewer samples? We'll get back to that in a second. I want to talk about the second problem. The second concept is something called filtering, and filtering is used to remove unwanted information from the signal. You don't really need to know anything about the signal, you just need to know what you don't want. So here I've decided I just don't like cars. I don't like playing with cars. So whatever's in this toy box, I don't care, just don't give me a car. Fine. I was a very spoiled child. This is what it looks like from the technical point of view then. This is the signal that we saw before. This is its frequency domain representation. We decided that we don't want any of this. It's gone. We've just done low-pass filtering. And if we bring it back to the computer, how does the computer modify this signal? Well, once it has it, it does something called digital filtering. And here we go. We have our filtered signal. So we have the original box minus the car that we don't want. The problem with this approach is that it's completely inefficient. We're sampling data, and then we're removing the data that we don't want. And that doesn't make sense. It's a complete waste of resources. What we really want to do is that we want to sample and filter at the same time, like these two gentlemen here are doing. So the answer to both of these questions, the way that we solve both of these problems, is by proposing a new approach. And this new approach has two following goals. It's got two problems that it needs to solve. It needs to reduce the samples that we need to get the information that we want, and we want to filter and sample at the same time. So how do we do that? We first need to explain a property of signals, and I promise this is as complicated as it's going to get. After this, it should be much less technical. There is a type of signal called a sparse signal, and these signals contain relatively little information. Many signals fall into this category, but in box speak, we can think about it as a big box with nothing in it, right? So this box only has 2 toys compared to the one previously that had 5, but the box is actually the same size. If our signal is of this nature, and many are, then we can use this as an opportunity to efficiently obtain the information. How do we do it? We shake the box. We shake the box really, really, really hard until all the toy parts break apart. And so when you finally open your box full of broken toys and you put your hand in it and you pull out a handful, well, you know what's in the box. You'll get the arm from the doll, the wheel from the car, half a trumpet. You won't get everything, but you will get information about everything. And all it took you was one handful. Effectively, we've reduced the number of samples. The second great thing about this approach is that the way that we shake the box actually influences the toy parts that you get. So if you imagine we have a car in our box, well, if we shake it side to side, maybe the car will roll to one side of the box, and when you open it, you only get car parts. So effectively, you've filtered as you sampled. If you only want the doll, well, shake it in a different direction. That way, you only get the doll. But if you don't care, just shake the box in every direction. You won't get any filtering, but you will reduce the amount of samples needed. The final thing I want to get over quickly before going on to a quick case study is, when we talk about machine learning, one of the main things that it does is something called classification. And so it's a key part of machine learning, and effectively you use the characteristics of a signal to determine the nature of the signal. So how long is it? What's its period? What's its amplitude? In box speak, by seeing what's inside the box, can we figure out where it came from? So in this case, this box came from the toy shop. The characteristics that we use to determine where the box comes from occur post-sampling. But in our approach, we are reducing the amount of samples and we're removing unwanted information. And doing that makes this whole classification process much more efficient. So in the whole classification process, this is where the improvement in efficiency occurs. Now all of that is out of the way, I think it might be quite interesting to have a look at a case study, how we use this approach in the real world. The application that I looked at is acoustic vehicle detection and identification. So as the name suggests, it's using microphones to detect and identify vehicles based on their sounds. It's useful because it's a cheap and effective way of improving road safety. You don't need to do any road works or anything like that. You just plop a couple of microphones down and you can get going. So the installation costs are low, but the actual analysis and leveraging of the data is quite costly computationally. So is it possible to use our proposed approach to make these systems more efficient? And this is what we investigated in our research. The first step is, what kind of signals are we looking at? So in this case, we're looking at cars. Can we identify this vehicle as a car, as a scooter, or are no vehicles passing at this particular point in time? And we got these signals in 3 different weather conditions: when it was clear, when it was raining, and when it was windy. I know you can't see the wind on the picture, but I promise you it was windy. So this looks a lot more complicated than it is. Effectively, it's just the same frequency representation thing that we saw earlier, just for the average vehicle signals. So this is what the frequency distribution, for example, of the average car looks like, of the average scooter looks like, and for the average period of time with no vehicles. Everything to the left here, 3 kilohertz, we don't want that. That's background noise. We want to keep everything here, that's on the right here of this pivot point. So when we talk about filtering in this case, what we mean is that we want to remove this and keep this. So how do we check that this approach is actually useful? I mean, is it worth doing? Well, the best way to do that is to check it by comparing it to an existing method. So what we're checking is shaking our box better than just systematically taking every toy out of your toy box? Our new approach, we'll see, uses 16 times fewer samples than the existing approach. That's great, but to really check if it's a valid approach, we need to check two things. First, we need to check the accuracy of the system. By accuracy, we mean what's the proportion of correct versus incorrect predictions. So how often does it call a car a car? The second thing is the runtime. That's the length of time that the system takes to produce predictions. So if our system takes a year but is more precise, well, that's not really helpful, right? We want our system to do it quickly. So first we have a look at the accuracy results. Simply put, this says, how good is our new system at doing its job? And it's pretty good at doing its job. In all weather conditions, it gets 80% of the predictions correct. As expected, it does better in clear conditions and not quite as well in adverse weather conditions. We can compare it to the previous approach. So the previous approach was only tested in clear conditions. So if we compare like for like, we can see that they're pretty close. I mean, the new approach is a bit less accurate, but it does use 16 times less samples, which is a pretty good trade-off. So we can say that the new system is good at its job. The second set of results that we're interested in are the runtime results. So in this case, the runtime is a measure of system efficiency. We run the two systems on identical hardware, and we time the process. And we can see that our new system is faster at every stage of the process. And so we can sort of say that our 16-fold reduction in the number of samples has directly led to an approximately 3 times faster runtime, which is pretty good. So our new system is more efficient. So in conclusion, we saw really that in the case study, our new approach got similar accuracy to previously existing systems, and it did so at a significantly reduced computational cost. It concretely illustrated then how this box shaking approach can be used to improve the efficiency of classification systems. And therefore, to tie it back into the title of the presentation, we showed that it was possible to help computers understand the world more efficiently. That's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, you can email me here. This is my laboratory, if you are interested in any of this research. And finally, the case study and a lot of the background theory is covered in this publication here. I believe it's open access, so you should just be able to Google this. But if you email me, and if you can't find it, if you email me, I'm more than happy to share it with any of you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Billy. Oh, that's a great talk. Okay, the floor is open for questions. All right? Okay, all right, so we'll go you, and then.
So in the system you described filtering out before a pivot point.
Yes.
Is that does your system figure out what the pivot point is by itself, or is that something that you have to manually configure for each different application?
That's correct. I need to change that depending on the application.
So you're simply sampling at a 16 times slower rate, or
Yes.
are you adjusting the sampling speed dynamically? That's on average 16 times less samples? Or how it
No, it's not dynamic. It's 16 is how we determined it heuristically, effectively. I checked a couple of different sampling rates, and 16 was the best balance between performance and accuracy, effectively.
So the A to D sampler is simply taking samples at 1/16th the rate of the previous approach.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So this is for audio.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question, Fred.
Is that for audio?
Um,
Have you
it-
tried some
it-
images in 3D data?
Yes, so in this case it was with audio. I also did it with smartwatch sensor readings. And it can be done with any signal that's considered, well, sparse, but it doesn't have to be that strict. You can use this approach.
So text and things like that as well.
I'm sorry, Mike.
Text and things like that as well.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I probably don't need this, but can you go back? Oh, sorry. Can you go back to the slide that had the 3 weather conditions?
Yes.
And sorry, I just want to take a look. Yeah, that one. Oh, sorry, the next one with the graph. Yeah, that one. Okay. Kilohertz.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not from the world of kilohertz. Can you?
Sorry, a kilohertz is 1,000 hertz. And
Okay.
1 hertz is 1 sample per second. So that's 48,000 samples per second. So if you have, say you start singing,
Yeah.
and there's a microphone that will pick up your voice, what's happening is that 1 second, 48,000 times, the computer is going to sample what you said. It's going to, at that given time, it's going to give it a value, which will be converted into ones and zeros, and then that can get converted into digital information. And the higher that number, the more faithful the representation is.
Imagine trying to draw a picture with a fine tip pen versus a big fat pen.
Yeah.
The small pen will give you more accurate.
It's like pixels for an image, right? The more pixels, the higher resolution your image.
So sorry, just a follow-up question. Can you go back to the weather one? So those were the 3 conditions that were tested, correct?
Yes, I was trying to get these 3 types of category, and I made sure to get them in different weather conditions.
I see. Like those specific conditions.
I guess the idea was to show that the system was robust.
Okay.
That it wasn't, I hadn't cherry-picked sounds that I got in a nice clear day.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Some sort of control on it. It was interesting that I guess the windy conditions had a lower success rate because there's more sound to wind. Is that?
So my theory is that, in fact, the rain was quite good, and I think because rain is constant and consistent, it's quite easy to filter out.
Mm-hmm.
Wind isn't. So if you've got, say, 100 samples of cars taken in clear and rain, if you're knocking this out, well, some of the rain sound is actually part of this, so you're knocking out the rain sounds. So it's not really too much of a problem. But the wind sound, I mean, it's very unpredictable. It could come here, it could come there.
The inconsistency.
Exactly.
I see,
That's
okay.
much harder to filter out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
So you're talking about filtering. Is there 2 kinds of, and reducing the number of samples?
Yes.
They're 2 separate concepts, right?
Yes.
So the red stuff on this slide, the background noise, that's filtering.
Yes.
And reducing the samples is taking fewer of the points, right? That's
Correct.
okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
No,
Just clarifying.
No,
So the efficiency is caused by fewer samples, not the filtering.
that's correct. I think it's correct to say that the accuracy is really a function of the filtering, and the runtime is a factor of the sampling.
So in terms of that particular case study, are you detecting the presence of any cars or any scooters at all, or are you detecting sort of traffic levels?
The former, yes.
You started out your talk saying that we're spending enormous amount of energy on storing enormous amounts of data.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how that compares to data storage in the biological world that came about by evolution. So in every cell of every organism, we have DNA storing lots and lots of data, and also in the brains of all the animals, there's lots of data being stored and processed. And presumably there's a energy cost per megabyte, and there is also space cost per megabyte. Do you have any idea how that compares to the energy cost and the space cost per megabyte in these data centers that are storing all our JPEGs?
No, I'm afraid I don't. Sorry.
Because the world is full of information storage even before computers, and I'm wondering how we're doing.
Right.
In terms of that.
But I mean, it's an interesting point. If the idea is that our brains maybe are more effective at storing data, and I guess what I'm trying to think is that, like, hopefully with this approach, it can be another more effective way to store data. I didn't touch on it too much, but in fact, too many slides. Here, you can, in fact, it's possible to reconstruct the original toys from the bits of toys if you use mathematical algorithms, which I use and not really understand. But, and so, in fact, you can think of this as a form of compression. If you of lossless compression, if you're sampling the data this way, you can store it in this manner. And if one day you decide that you want to reconstruct it later on, you can. You just need to apply a certain algorithm to it. And in that way, you're shifting the computational burden further down the chain, if that makes sense.
Okay, I want to give a simple question. Can you show up what is that? The frequency power graph, like of the each vehicle? Yeah. You said like the red part is the background noise.
Yes.
How did you define it?
By listening to it.
Okay.
No, and also if you in some of the previous research as well, it's quite clear that all of this you can, if you can get rid of it, you should get rid of it.
Probably time for one more question. Like, so I do have one. This is more perhaps beyond what we talked about today, but you do work in the humanophilic lab.
Yes.
Right. And so it's I take it your work and your colleagues' work is all about trying to simulate the real world experience into computers, trying to make computers understand the real world. So today we talked about auditory stuff. Like, what sort of conditions, what sort of work is going into like other parts of like sensory parts?
In my lab?
Well, or in the field itself, or
just otherwise, I would say you can just ask my boss. He can tell you what's going on. Well, in fact, so for example, I know that he's looking at Wi-Fi sensing. So we already have Wi-Fi. If I get this wrong, I'm sorry, but we already have Wi-Fi everywhere. We use it to connect to the internet. We can also use it for sensing applications. Well, that's great because we don't have to build anything new. Like, we're piggybacking off already existing infrastructure. What else is done in the lab? It's embarrassing, I don't know. There's stuff about like wearables as well, right? Like, you're doing wearable related stuff, is that correct? So what
shopping.
Shopping?
Yes, there's also research about shopping.
Oh, like yeah, do you want to, maybe you can...
You got about a minute and a half.
Okay. So there's a lot of things.
like relative to what humans doing. Sometimes like when you are inside a meeting, and what kind of facial expression are you doing, or like some sounds, or maybe. And we are also doing like when people are shopping, and we are using a camera to record the people, the customer, like what kind of item that they are looking for, that sort of research. Yeah. And there's some examples. Yes.
I think you should have done the talk instead of me.
Well, no, okay. Leave your email address with us, please. We'll get in touch with you. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Billy. Please give a round of applause for the speaker.